I unlocked Eleanor's old suitcase less than an hour after we returned from the cemetery. My hands were still trembling from lowering her into the ground, yet the last promise I'd ever made to my wife refused to wait until morning. "Not before I'm gone," she had whispered the night before she died. "And whatever you find, don't let anyone tell you what it means until you've seen every piece." I expected letters from another man, hidden savings, or some confession she'd carried for 40 years. Instead, I found faded postcards, worn train tickets, children's crayon drawings, and a stack of Veterans Day programs tied together with a blue ribbon. Before I could understand any of it, my younger brother Richard looked over my shoulder and quietly said, "Looks like Eleanor never really let go of whoever came before you." In that moment, I wasn't sure whether I'd just opened an old suitcase or the first crack in everything I believed about our marriage. If you've ever wondered whether love can still surprise you after a lifetime together, I hope you'll stay with me. Richard's words lingered in the room long after he stopped speaking. We had buried Eleanor only 3 hours earlier beneath a maple tree whose leaves had already begun turning gold. And now my own brother was suggesting that the woman I'd shared 46 years with had lived beside me while quietly carrying someone else in her heart. I wanted to tell him to leave. Instead, I simply closed my eyes and took the same slow breath that had steadied me through countless tense moments during my years as a Navy communications specialist. Back then, rushing to the first explanation usually meant missing the real message hidden beneath the noise. Eleanor used to tease me about that habit. "Louis," she'd laugh, "you'll study a grocery list like it's classified intelligence." She never mocked the patience behind it. In fact, I sometimes wondered whether she admired it more than she admitted. The suitcase itself looked older than our marriage. Brown leather, cracked at every corner, with brass locks polished smooth by decades of careful hands. I'd asked about it more than once over the years. Every time, Eleanor smiled gently, rested her fingers on the lid, and said exactly the same sentence. "One day you'll understand why it stays closed." She never sounded frightened. She never sounded guilty. Only certain. That certainty haunted me now. I lifted the blue ribbon and spread the contents across our dining room table. None of it looked valuable. A postcard from Omaha with no signature. A train ticket dated 1988. Another from 1997. Children's drawings of birds, houses, and flags. Every Veterans Day program had a tiny pencil mark beside one printed name, though the name changed from year to year. Eleanor hadn't been the sort of woman who collected souvenirs. She kept only what mattered, and she threw away everything else without ceremony. Seeing so many ordinary objects preserved with such care felt strangely out of character. Richard picked up one drawing showing 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. "Whose kids were these?" he asked. "I don't know." "You honestly never asked?" "I asked about the suitcase." She never answered. He laid the drawing down more carefully than he'd picked it up. "You know," he said quietly, "Mom once hinted Eleanor had a difficult life before she met you. Maybe she just couldn't leave all of it behind." His words sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Because they fit the evidence sitting in front of us. Yet one detail refused to settle in my mind. Every train ticket was dated within a week of Veterans Day. That couldn't be coincidence. Not after 40 years. I reached beneath the final stack of postcards and discovered one small envelope tucked into the lining of the suitcase. Across the front, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, were only 6 words. Begin with Margaret. She remembers everything. The name Margaret stayed in my thoughts all night. I placed the envelope back inside the suitcase exactly where Eleanor had hidden it, as though disturbing the order she had created might somehow erase the path she intended me to follow. After 46 years together, I trusted one thing without question. Eleanor never did anything carelessly. If she wanted me to begin with Margaret, there had to be a reason she believed every other answer depended on that woman. The next morning, I drove to the small kitchen where veterans gathered for breakfast every Thursday. Eleanor and I had volunteered there for years, and if anyone knew the older military families in our county, it would be the people serving coffee before sunrise. I carried only the Omaha postcard in my jacket pocket. Something about it felt like the safest place to begin. Most of the volunteers offered quiet condolences before returning to their work. Then an elderly woman named Hazel stopped wiping the counter when she saw the postcard. "I haven't seen one of those in years," she murmured. "You recognize it?" She hesitated. I recognized the handwriting. My pulse quickened. "You knew Eleanor wrote this?" Hazel nodded slowly. "She mailed one every Veterans Day." "To Margaret?" She looked surprised. "So she finally told you?" "No," I answered. "She left me a name, nothing more." Hazel folded the dish towel over her shoulder and lowered her voice. "Margaret Dawson lives over in Pine Ridge now. Eleanor visited her almost every November. Never missed a year unless she was in the hospital." Richard's theory echoed inside my head again. Another woman. Annual visits. 40 years. Even Hazel's words seemed to support the idea that Eleanor had lived part of her life beyond my understanding. Yet something still refused to fit. If this had been some hidden emotional attachment, why would Eleanor deliberately leave me directions to find it? She had spent too much effort protecting the truth to suddenly expose it without purpose. On the drive home, I stopped beside the Veterans Memorial downtown. Veterans Day banners already hung across Main Street, and volunteers were setting rows of folding chairs for the coming ceremony. Looking across the empty plaza, I suddenly realized every train ticket inside the suitcase matched cities that hosted major regional Veterans Day commemorations. Eleanor hadn't been traveling randomly. She had been following a schedule, a pattern. Back home, I spread everything across the dining table again. This time I arranged the postcards by date instead of location. Then the train tickets. Finally, the children's drawings. For the first time, a sequence emerged. Every drawing appeared shortly after one of the train trips. Every postcard followed within days, as though each visit had led to another quiet exchange. Claire arrived just before dinner carrying a casserole. None of us were hungry enough to eat. She noticed the table immediately. "Dad, you've been looking at those all day?" "I think they're connected." Richard sighed from the living room. "Or maybe you're trying too hard to make them connected." Claire picked up one drawing carefully. A little girl had drawn a woman standing beside an American flag, while another figure wore a Navy uniform. Across the bottom, in uneven block letters, were the words, "Thank you for remembering us." Claire looked at me. "Those aren't love letters. No, they're children's pictures." Richard crossed his arms. "Children thank teachers all the time. That doesn't explain 40 years. He wasn't wrong. It explained almost nothing, but it changed one important thing. For the first time since opening the suitcase, I no longer felt like I was searching for proof that Eleanor had hidden someone from me. Instead, I felt as though I was searching for a promise she had refused to abandon. Just before bed, I called the number Hazel had written on a scrap of paper. An elderly voice answered after the fourth ring. "Margaret Dawson speaking." "My name is Lewis Grant." Silence. Then a soft intake of breath. I'm Eleanor's husband." Another long silence followed. Finally, she whispered words that sent a chill through my entire body. "I've been praying that call would never come, because it means she's gone." Margaret agreed to meet me 2 days later at a small public library overlooking Pine Ridge Lake. She insisted we choose a place with plenty of people around, which struck me as odd until I remembered Eleanor's final instruction. "Don't let anyone tell you what it means until you've seen every piece." My wife hadn't asked me to trust Margaret. She'd asked me to finish gathering the evidence before reaching any conclusion. During 30 years in Navy communications, I'd learned that incomplete information could sound perfectly convincing. The greatest mistakes rarely came from lies. They came from messages that ended one sentence too soon. When I arrived, Margaret was already sitting near a window, with a worn canvas bag resting beside her chair. She looked to be in her late 70s, dressed simply, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted blue cap despite the mild weather. She stood slowly when she saw me, and before either of us spoke, tears filled her eyes. "I wanted Eleanor to outlive me," she whispered. "So did I." For several moments, neither of us could say anything else. Finally, she gestured toward the empty chair. "She told me this day might come." "Then you know why she left me your name?" Margaret nodded, but immediately shook her head. "I know why she trusted you. I don't know how much she wanted you to learn today." That answer frustrated me more than I expected. My brother thinks she spent 40 years hiding part of her life from me. Margaret lowered her eyes. "Richard always reached conclusions faster than your wife." "You know Richard?" "I've known your whole family longer than you realize." She reached into the canvas bag and removed a folded Veterans Day program dated 1994. I recognized the tiny pencil mark beside a single printed name, the same careful mark Eleanor had made on every program inside the suitcase. "I hope this would answer your questions," Margaret said. Instead, it created another. The marked name wasn't Margaret Dawson. It belonged to a man named Captain Daniel Dawson. "I don't understand." "You won't. Not yet." She slid the program back into the bag before I could study it longer. For the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I felt genuine irritation. "Margaret, my wife trusted me with this after she died. Please don't make me solve riddles." She looked directly into my eyes. "I'm protecting her promise, not hiding it." There was a difference. I wasn't sure I appreciated it. Then Margaret asked a question I never saw coming. "Lewis, during your deployments, did Eleanor ever mention receiving groceries she couldn't explain?" I searched my memory. "No." "Or anonymous repairs around the house?" I frowned. "There was a furnace contractor once. Eleanor said the church had arranged it." Margaret smiled sadly. "No church paid for that." My thoughts stopped. Before I could ask another question, she reached into her bag again and handed me a small envelope addressed in Eleanor's handwriting. Unlike the one in the suitcase, this envelope had already been opened years ago. Inside was a single photograph. 3 children stood beside a weathered farmhouse waving tiny American flags. Behind them, almost hidden near the porch steps, stood Eleanor. Standing beside her was Margaret. On the back, Eleanor had written only one sentence. "Some debts should never embarrass the people who receive kindness." I stared at those words for what felt like an hour. Every assumption Richard had planted inside my mind suddenly weakened. Yet one mystery became even larger. If Eleanor had spent decades quietly helping Margaret's family, who had first helped Eleanor enough to make her believe the debt could never truly be repaid? Margaret carefully returned the photograph to its envelope. "I can answer that," she said softly. "But first, Louis, there's someone else's mistake you've been carrying for 40 years, and neither you nor Eleanor ever knew it." Those words changed the direction of my search before I even understood what they meant. Margaret's words followed me into the parking lot like an echo I couldn't shake. "There's someone else's mistake you've been carrying for 40 years. During my years in Navy communications, I'd watched misunderstandings grow into disasters simply because one message arrived too late, or one sentence reached the wrong person. Eleanor knew those stories better than anyone. She often told me that every family carried its own version of crossed signals. I had always assumed she was speaking in generalities. Now I wondered if she'd been quietly describing our own life. Margaret invited me to her farmhouse the following afternoon. She refused to explain anything over the telephone, insisting that some memories deserved more respect than a hurried conversation. The drive through Pine Ridge took nearly an hour, giving me plenty of time to replay every Veterans Day we had shared. Eleanor had always claimed she was volunteering at regional remembrance events whenever she traveled alone. I had believed her because it matched the woman I knew. What I never questioned was why those trips always ended with the same quiet smile on her face, a smile that carried both peace and sadness. Margaret welcomed me into a modest living room where family photographs covered one wall from floor to ceiling. There were graduation pictures, wedding portraits, military uniforms, birthday cakes, grandchildren holding fishing poles. It was the sort of wall Eleanor would stop and admire for 10 minutes, because she believed every photograph represented someone refusing to let ordinary moments disappear. Margaret placed a weathered wooden box on the coffee table. "Eleanor asked me not to open this until you understood the first part." She lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of thank you cards. None of them were addressed to Eleanor. Everyone carried Margaret Dawson's name. "I don't understand," I admitted. "You will." She handed me the oldest card. It had been written by a local grocery owner in 1983. "Thank you for paying Mrs. Dawson's account again. As always, your request for anonymity will be respected." Another card came from a furnace repair company. Another from a school principal. Another from a children's dentist. Different years. Different businesses. The same pattern. Anonymous assistance. I looked up slowly. "Eleanor paid for all of this?" Margaret nodded. "No." The answer stunned me. "No." I never knew who paid. My confusion deepened. "But these thank you cards were sent to me by mistake." She reached beneath the stack and removed a single unopened envelope that had yellowed with age. "The businesses assumed I was the donor because the payments always arrived through the same post office box." "Whose box?" Margaret took a long breath. "I thought it belonged to Eleanor." It didn't? She gently shook her head. It belonged to Captain Daniel Dawson, my husband. The room suddenly felt smaller. But Daniel died before most of these dates. He did. Neither of us spoke. Then Margaret continued. After Daniel was killed, the military accidentally continued routing one small survivor assistance account through that old postal address for several months. Eleanor discovered the mistake before anyone else did. I leaned forward. So she fixed it? She tried. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The paperwork was corrected. The money stopped. She looked toward the family photographs. But Eleanor couldn't forget how frightened I was during those months. She told me once that she'd watched me standing in the grocery store trying to decide which food to leave behind because I couldn't afford all of it. I closed my eyes. Eleanor had never mentioned that day. Not once. Margaret continued quietly. She said something that changed my life. What was it? Kindness shouldn't make people feel indebted. It should make them feel less alone. Those words sounded exactly like Eleanor. Simple, gentle, impossible to argue with. I finally understood why every receipt, postcard, train ticket, and drawing had been preserved. They were never trophies. They were milestones marking promises kept. Yet one question remained unanswered. If all this began with a temporary accounting mistake, I asked, why did Eleanor keep helping for 40 years after everything had already been corrected? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked to the bookshelf, and removed one final blue binder tied with the same ribbon that had wrapped the suitcase. When she returned, she placed it gently into my hands. Louis, she whispered, everything you've seen so far explains what Eleanor did. She rested one trembling hand on the cover. This explains why she believed she owed the debt in the first place. The blue binder felt heavier than it should have. It contained no metal, no photographs mounted on thick paper, nothing that could explain its weight. Yet when I carried it to Margaret's kitchen table, it seemed as though I was lifting 40 years of silence with both hands. Eleanor had organized every page in perfect chronological order, just as she arranged our household bills and family recipes. There were dates, receipts, folded notes, newspaper clippings, and short handwritten entries that never wandered beyond a few careful sentences. She hadn't written a diary. She had built a record. The first page was dated October 1982. I recognized my own deployment schedule immediately. While I was stationed overseas, Margaret's husband, Captain Daniel Dawson, had been killed during a training accident. I remembered receiving the casualty notice through official channels. I remembered standing silently beside the communications console after reading his name, thinking only of another family about to receive unbearable news. What I never knew was what happened weeks later, after the military notifications ended and ordinary life began demanding impossible choices from a young widow raising 3 children. Eleanor had written only one sentence beneath the date. Today I watched pride lose to hunger. I looked toward Margaret. That was the grocery store. She nodded. You already know that part. The next page explained what I had never imagined. Eleanor had entered the store intending to buy canned soup for a church food drive. She noticed Margaret quietly removing bread, milk, and cereal from her cart because she couldn't afford everything at once. Margaret never asked for help. She never cried. She simply smiled politely at the cashier and began putting necessities back onto the shelves, one item at a time. "I didn't know anyone was watching," Margaret whispered. Eleanor couldn't forget it. Neither could I. Several pages later, I found copies of money orders made out to businesses instead of people. Heating companies, school cafeterias, pharmacies, clothing stores before winter. Every payment carried one instruction: no donor name. The binder answered one mystery after another, but each answer deepened my admiration for the woman I thought I had known completely. Eleanor never wanted Margaret to feel rescued. She wanted her to keep her dignity. Then I reached a page that made my hands stop turning. It wasn't a receipt. It was a letter Eleanor had written but never mailed. Louis would insist on helping if he knew. That's exactly why I can't tell him yet. He serves enough people every day in ways no one sees. I won't place another burden on his conscience while he's still carrying the weight of other families' losses. When he finally learns the truth, I hope it happens after we're both old enough to understand that love isn't measured by how much we're told. Sometimes it's measured by what we're trusted to finish. I couldn't read the final sentence without wiping my eyes. For the first time since her funeral, I cried without trying to hide it. Margaret reached across the table and quietly squeezed my hand. "She never doubted you." I doubted her. "No," Margaret replied gently. "You doubted the silence." There was a difference. One I wished I had understood years earlier. As the afternoon sunlight faded across the kitchen floor, we continued reading until the final divider inside the binder. It contained only one document, a handwritten checklist dated 6 months before Eleanor's death. Every annual visit had been marked complete. Every anonymous payment had ended years earlier. Only one line remained unchecked. Veterans Day. Final conversation with Louis. I stared at those words until they blurred. She had planned this from the moment she learned she was dying. Not because she wanted to reveal a secret, because she wanted me to complete something she no longer had time to do. Just then my phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice sounded unusually tense. "Dad, Uncle Richard's been here." "What happened?" "He took the suitcase." The room went completely silent. "He says if Eleanor wanted the truth known," Claire continued, struggling to stay calm, "the whole family deserves to see everything before Veterans Day." I looked at the binder in front of me. Richard didn't know the suitcase held only half the story, but if he started showing those keepsakes without the binder, he could destroy everything Eleanor had spent 40 years protecting. By the time I reached my house, Richard had already gone. Claire stood in the doorway with red eyes and folded arms, blaming herself for letting him inside. I hugged her before asking a single question. Eleanor had spent her life protecting people from unnecessary shame. The last thing I intended to do was turn my daughter into another casualty of a misunderstanding. "He didn't force his way in," Claire said quietly. "He honestly thought he was doing the right thing." "I know. He kept saying families shouldn't keep secrets." I almost answered that Eleanor hadn't kept a secret. She had protected a promise. But I stopped myself. Margaret had been right. If I spoke too soon, I would only repeat the mistake Richard was already making, drawing conclusions before every piece of evidence had found its place. I carried the blue binder into my study and locked it inside the old filing cabinet where Eleanor kept our wills and insurance papers. For the first time since opening the suitcase, I deliberately chose to appear less informed than I really was. If Richard believed the suitcase alone contained the entire story, he would eventually reveal exactly how he planned to use it. 30 years monitoring military communications had taught me that people often exposed their intentions once they believed no one was standing in their way. The following morning, Richard called. "I've asked everyone to meet Saturday afternoon." "So soon?" "Veterans Day is 3 days away. They deserve answers." "I agree." My calm response surprised him. "I thought you'd argue." "I won't." A long silence followed. "Really? Really?" He thanked me before hanging up, sounding almost relieved. Claire stared at me from across the breakfast table. "Dad, you're just letting this happen?" I said I wouldn't argue. "That's not the same thing." "No." She studied my face for several seconds before a faint smile appeared. Mom would have recognized that look. "What look?" "The one you had whenever you already knew more than you were saying." I couldn't help smiling back. Perhaps Eleanor had understood me even better than I had understood myself. Later that afternoon, I returned to Margaret's farmhouse carrying photocopies of several pages from the binder instead of the originals. She immediately understood why. "You don't trust Richard." "I trust his intentions, but not his conclusions." "Exactly." She nodded with quiet approval. Together we spread the copies across her dining table. Every receipt from the suitcase now matched a corresponding note inside the binder. The postcards aligned with annual visits. The train tickets matched Veterans Day ceremonies. Even the children's drawings carried dates that coincided with milestones in Margaret's family: high school graduations, college acceptance letters, military enlistments, weddings. Track after track of seemingly meaningless keepsakes had become one continuous chain of evidence. Then Margaret reached into a desk drawer and removed the final document Eleanor had left in her care. It wasn't a letter. It was a notarized statement signed 6 months before Eleanor's death. "I promised not to give this to you unless someone misunderstood the suitcase," Margaret explained. "I wish no one had." So did Eleanor. I read the first paragraph slowly. The document confirmed that every anonymous payment, every annual visit, every preserved keepsake had been Eleanor's deliberate decision. It also stated, in unmistakable language, that Margaret had repeatedly tried to end the arrangement. "I asked Eleanor dozens of times to stop," Margaret had testified. "She always answered the same way. The day you no longer need kindness isn't the day gratitude ends. It's the day gratitude begins traveling through someone else." I set the statement down. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been quietly growing inside me since opening the suitcase. "Margaret, why didn't you ever tell me?" She looked toward the window where the afternoon sun settled across the fields. "Because she made me promise. And if she'd lived another 10 years, I still wouldn't have told you." "Why?" She smiled sadly. "Because some promises aren't about hiding the truth. They're about protecting the dignity of everyone inside it." Her answer settled something deep inside me. Richard wasn't my enemy. Neither was the rest of the family. Their only mistake was seeing half a picture and believing it was complete. Saturday's gathering would give everyone one final opportunity to stop repeating that mistake, or to continue it. As I prepared to leave, Margaret handed me the notarized statement and the blue binder. The suitcase can create suspicion, she said softly. She looked directly into my eyes. But these... She rested her hand on the binder. Turn every clue into proof. On the drive home, I realized something Eleanor had planned years before I understood it. The trap had never been built to embarrass Richard. It had been built to let incomplete assumptions expose themselves before the complete truth quietly replaced them. And one question stayed with me all the way home. How many of us judge the people we love after seeing only half the evidence? Saturday arrived wrapped in the quiet gray light that always seemed to settle over our town before Veterans Day. By the time I pulled into Claire's driveway, nearly every member of our family had already gathered inside. Richard stood beside the dining table with Eleanor's old suitcase open before him, its contents arranged as though they were exhibits in a trial. The postcards lay in neat rows. The train tickets formed a careful stack. The children's drawings rested where everyone could see them. Looking around the room, I recognized the same expressions I had worn only days earlier: curiosity, uncertainty, disappointment, and the painful fear that someone deeply loved might have lived an entirely different life. Richard greeted me with visible relief. "I'm glad you came. I told you I would." He nodded toward the suitcase. "I haven't accused Eleanor of anything. I just think the family deserves to know what she never explained. No anger, no cruelty, only confidence built on incomplete evidence. Exactly as Eleanor had predicted." Claire quietly moved beside me. "The binder?" I rested one hand against the leather case I carried. "Right here." Richard cleared his throat. "I've spent the last 2 days looking through everything. 40 years of trips, anonymous postcards, children's drawings no one recognizes, Veterans Day programs marked with the same pencil. I don't think Eleanor meant any harm, but I believe she lived with unfinished feelings about someone she never spoke about." No one interrupted him, because his conclusion sounded reasonable. If the suitcase had been all we possessed, I might have reached the same one myself. Richard lifted one faded postcard. This arrived from Omaha in 1986. He held up a train ticket. Another trip in 1991. Then he displayed one of the children's drawings. And who exactly are these children? Silence settled across the room. Finally, Claire looked toward me. "Dad?" I stepped forward slowly. "I'd like everyone to wait just a few more minutes before deciding what these things mean." Richard folded his arms. "I'm listening." I placed the blue binder beside the suitcase without opening it. "Richard, before today, did you know every train ticket falls within a week of Veterans Day?" He frowned. "No." "Did you know every postcard was mailed after those trips?" "No." "Did you know each drawing matches a graduation, birthday, military enlistment, or wedding in the same family?" He hesitated. "No." I nodded gently. Neither did I. The room remained silent. Then I opened the binder. Instead of speaking immediately, I handed the oldest receipt to Claire. She read aloud. "Thank you for paying Mrs. Dawson's grocery account. Your request for anonymity will be respected." Another receipt went to my niece. Heating assistance. Another, school lunches. Another, winter coats. Each page carried dates matching the keepsakes inside the suitcase. Confusion slowly replaced suspicion from across every face in the room. Richard frowned. "Where did these come from?" "Margaret Dawson." And who's Margaret? Before I could answer, the front door opened quietly. Every head turned. Margaret stepped inside carrying nothing except a folded American flag. No one had expected her. Richard certainly hadn't. She walked directly to the table and gently rested the flag beside the suitcase. "My husband was Captain Daniel Dawson," she said softly. The room became perfectly still. I buried him while Lewis was serving overseas. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret looked around the room before continuing. "Your Eleanor saw me trying to choose which groceries my children would have to live without." Tears filled Claire's eyes. Margaret smiled through her own. She never offered charity. She touched one of the children's drawings. She offered dignity. One by one, she explained every postcard, every ticket, every drawing, every Veterans Day visit. Not once had Eleanor asked for thanks. Not once had she allowed anyone to tell the children who paid for school lunches or winter coats. When Margaret finished, Richard lowered himself into a chair without saying a word. He looked at the suitcase, then at the binder. Finally, at me. "I thought—" His voice broke. "I honestly thought I was protecting her memory." "You were," I answered quietly. "You just didn't have the whole story." For several long moments, no one spoke. Then Richard reached toward the suitcase, carefully gathered every postcard, every ticket, every drawing, and placed them back exactly where Eleanor had left them. "I judged her," he whispered. "No," Margaret replied gently. "You judged the silence." I had heard those words before. Only now did I understand why Eleanor trusted them to survive after she was gone. As everyone quietly absorbed the truth, I realized the suitcase had never been a test of faith. It had been a lesson in patience. And before the afternoon ended, one final page inside the binder would reveal the last promise Eleanor had asked me to fulfill. Veterans Day dawned beneath a cloudless sky, the kind Eleanor always called a gift because it allowed old soldiers to stand outside without worrying about rain. I carried the suitcase in one hand and the blue binder in the other as Claire and I walked toward the memorial where our town gathered every November. Margaret waited beside the flagpole wearing the same blue cap she had worn the day we first met. Richard arrived a few minutes later, quietly taking his place beside us without saying a word. He didn't need to. Some apologies become visible long before they're spoken. Just before the ceremony began, I opened the binder to the final page Eleanor had prepared. There were no receipts, no photographs, no explanations. Only one handwritten note. "Lewis, if you're reading this, then you've already learned that gratitude isn't something we finish. It's something we continue. Please don't honor me by telling everyone what I did. Honor me by making sure no military family in this town ever has to wonder whether anyone remembers them. If one quiet act of kindness survives me, then I've already received more thanks than I ever deserved." I folded the page carefully and looked toward Margaret. "We'll keep your promise," I said softly. She smiled through tears. "No," she answered. "We'll keep hers." After the remembrance ceremony ended, Richard stepped forward before anyone else could leave. He faced the small crowd, his voice unsteady but clear. "I misunderstood my sister-in-law." He paused, glancing briefly toward the suitcase resting beside the memorial. I mistook silence for secrecy. Then he looked at me. And I mistook ordinary keepsakes for evidence of hidden love, when they were really evidence of love given quietly to people who needed it most. No one applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, neighbors simply nodded, several veterans removed their caps, and a few military families embraced one another without speaking. That afternoon, Margaret and I returned the suitcase to my home. Together we placed every postcard, every train ticket, every child's drawing, and every Veterans Day program back inside exactly where Eleanor had left them. The blue ribbon rested across the top just as it had before I opened it for the first time. Nothing inside had changed. Only the people who understood it had. A month later, Claire organized the first Quiet Promise Fund through our local Veterans Association. The program offered anonymous grocery assistance, school supplies, heating repairs, and emergency help for military families facing difficult seasons. Every donation remained anonymous unless the giver insisted otherwise. Margaret volunteered every Thursday morning. Richard became the first regular donor, never allowing his name to appear on a single receipt. Sometimes I still sit beside Eleanor's suitcase in the evenings. I no longer wonder what she kept from me. I think instead about what she trusted me to finish. If this story reminded you that the smallest acts of kindness often become the longest-lasting legacy, I hope you'll carry that thought into someone else's life this week. May God bless every veteran, every military family, and every quiet heart that chooses compassion without asking to be remembered.